Putin built his strategy on one bet. NATO would tire, the West would split, and Russia could turn to Asia, leaning on China and the global South until the pressure eased. Today, that map is shaken from the East. Japan moves from restraint to action, and Moscow reads it as a threat to Russia's war model. Sai Takaichi, Japan's prime minister, arrives, the tone hardens, and Japan and Ukraine lock in a cooperation deal. The center of gravity is technology transfer, advanced capability moving toward Ukraine. In the Kremlin, the response is panic because this targets what Russia struggles to match: precision sensing, guidance, and the systems that turn weapons into results. I'm Andrew Collins, and you're watching my channel. Before we break this down, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. It helps this reporting reach more people, and it tells the platform to keep recommending this kind of analysis. The first question is how Tokyo does this under Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. Article 9 is supposed to block Japan from directly sending weapons to overseas conflicts. The move described here is not to openly break the restriction, it is to route around it with proxy design, diplomatic engineering not seen since World War II. The channel is NATO's Pearl structure. Japan joins as the structure expands into a logistics trust fund. In plain terms, Japanese yen enters the NATO pool, and Ukraine receives what the fund buys: American-made ammunition, radar systems, and electronic warfare equipment. Tokyo can say, "We are not shipping weapons," while the battlefield still gets tools that change the balance. The paperwork looks financial, but the effect arrives as capability. That matters because it changes the argument inside Tokyo. The question becomes less about weapons and more about financing and logistics. And for Moscow, it creates a moving target. You cannot block a shipment that never leaves Japan because the shipment is bought somewhere else. Why does Russia react so sharply? Because Japan's decisive strength is not mass production of old platforms. It is an industrial base built for what modern war runs on: sensors, optics, and semiconductors. Components that decide who detects first, who tracks first, and who survives contact. In November, Prime Minister Sai Takaichi promised strong backing for a fair and lasting peace to President Vladimir Zelensky. By February, the promise becomes a process. The signal is that Japan's precision engineering enters a contest where Russia has leaned on clumsy Soviet-era brute force and sheer volume. Russia is trying to sustain the war with quantity: Shahed drones from Iran and artillery shells begged for from North Korea. Japan enters with quality and artificial intelligence. The point is efficiency. Fewer systems doing more because they navigate better, identify faster, and resist interference. A drone that can't be jammed or a sensor that can't be fooled forces Russia to spend more for the same effect. One of the fastest shifts described is at sea. Ukraine's Mura and Sea Baby drones already pressure the Russian Black Sea Fleet into ports. The scenario says these evolve when paired with Japanese-made advanced navigation systems and night vision optics, shifting from one-way strikes into autonomous hunters. That connects to resistance against Russian EW system jamming. Japan's expertise is framed as a drone generation that is harder to blind and harder to misdirect. If jamming becomes less reliable, Russia loses a key method for turning Ukrainian drones into wasted fuel. On land, the scenario points to the Donbass front in eastern Ukraine, where Russian units are described as strained by ammunition shortages and logistical problems. Now add an opponent with maximized situational awareness, built from better sensing, tighter integration, and faster decision loops. Better awareness shortens reaction time, and short reaction time punishes slow logistics. From the viewpoint of a Russian general, surprise shrinks. The scenario argues that radar systems from Japan compress the window. If detection gets earlier and cleaner, surprise attack stops being dependable, and Russia is pushed into slower, more expensive methods. Once that window closes, Russia must either fire more to compensate or accept gaps. Either way, the attrition curve steepens for Russia, not Ukraine. There is also the mobility and protection question. The scenario points to HMMWV, like vehicles and modern armor that Japan can provide, improving Ukrainian infantry survival rates, while also noting that such military vehicles have not yet been provided. Even that caveat matters, because it signals a ladder of escalation that can climb without announcing itself. Now to the quieter but decisive layer. These contributions are often described as non-lethal, but they are framed as the brain of modern warfare. The engine is not the hard part. The hard part is the chip and sensor chain that guides a weapon with millimeter precision. In modern war, the non-lethal label can be a disguise. Sensors set the tempo, and chips decide accuracy. That is why the sanctions contrast is emphasized. While Russia is stripping chips from washing machines due to sanctions, Ukraine is described as gaining access to Japan's latest semiconductor and radar components. The claim is that this undermines Russia's air defense and surveillance superiority. Japanese radars and sensors are framed as giving Ukraine God's eye-like vision in locating Russian S-400 batteries, systems that must hide and spend resources to avoid being mapped. The agreement is also described as intelligence sharing and cybersecurity. Japan is presented as Asia's bastion of cyber defense. In that framing, Russian GRU hackers targeting infrastructure hit Japanese cybersecurity walls, adding digital armor to Ukraine's energy grid and command and control centers. And cyber defense is not just blocking attacks, it is keeping systems alive under pressure. Now to the attrition math. Russia aimed to win a war of attrition by depleting Western stockpiles and waiting out fatigue. The scenario argues Japan's entry breaks that equation. Russia's bet requires time. Japan's entry buys Ukraine time, and time is the one resource Russia needs to deny. As of February 2026, Japan has committed over $12 billion in financial aid to Ukraine. The scenario says this keeps the state operating while letting Kiev push more of its budget toward arms purchases and soldier salaries. Tokyo calls it stabilization. Moscow sees sustained war capacity. Then come the domino pressures. Japan's Pearl move is framed as pressure on South Korea, with the Seoul administration losing room to remain undecided. A precedent is suggested, South Korea relaxing its direct arms sales ban on Ukraine. And a specific lever is named: if South Korea opens its 155mm artillery shell stockpiles, Russia's logistics are described as facing collapse. At the same time, Beijing is forced to recalculate. Japan's integration with NATO is framed as a preview for Taiwan. And in that logic, China may reduce support for Russia, weakening Putin's belief in China's unlimited friendship support. Now the impact at home. The scenario describes the complete withdrawal of Japanese companies from the Russian market as a civilian shock, because Russian daily life depends on Japanese technology. Projects in Siberia and the Russian Far East decay without parts and engineering. Vladivostok becomes a symbol of isolation rather than trade. Diplomatically, Japan is described as rejecting neutrality and aligning with the Western alliance, under the idea that Europe's security and the Indo-Pacific are inseparable. The implication is that Russia's room in Asia goes to zero. Putin becomes persona non grata at Asian summits. Security fears widen around the Kuril Islands and the Far East. Japan's NATO alignment is described as placing a NATO standard presence on Russia's eastern border, while Russia is bogged down in Ukraine. Add the claim that Japan has doubled its military spending and acquired Tomahawk missiles, and the two-front war problem becomes real. Even culture becomes part of the pressure. Tokyo announces a $3.8 million fund through UNESCO to repair Ukraine's war-damaged cultural sites. UNESCO data is cited: more than 500 cultural sites have been damaged in Ukraine. Japan's satellite technology and inspection methods are framed as tools to identify and repair that damage, turning restoration into a message about legitimacy and leadership. Now the money war, aimed at elites. The scenario says Japan closes the East is safe exit, wealth moving from London and New York into Asian stock markets, by launching a systematic asset hunt from 2022 to 2026. More than 130 figures and organizations are targeted, including Prime Minister Mishustin and aluminium king Viktor Vekselberg. Approximately $32 billion in reserves from the Russian central bank is seized, vaporizing hopes of placing billions on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. The line is blunt: using Japanese yen becomes harder for an oligarch than going to Mars. The escape route named is Dubai. Since 2022, Roman Abramovich's yachts and private jets gather around Palm JRA. But pressure from Japan with the G7 and secondary sanctions imposed by the U.S. turns that refuge into a golden cage. UAE banks begin freezing Russian accounts. The cost of living rises, surveillance tightens, and the safe harbor becomes a trap. For ordinary Russians, the shock is daily life. Export restrictions and technology loss deepen inflation and replace quality with scarcity. A number is given: 92% of the population feels surrounded by enemies. The script frames this not as confidence, but as isolation anxiety. Russia sliding toward North Korea 2.0. Putin promised the invasion would make Russia greater. The scenario argues the opposite. NATO's steel wall in the west, Japan's economic and technological pressure in the east, and a fortress that begins to rot inward. If you want more breakdowns like this, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. And tell me where you think the pressure breaks first, on the front, in the economy, or inside Putin's circle.